across the entire internet. Maybe you can find it in some forum posts or the comment section of a YouTube video. As long as you're searching in the right places, you'll always find a sad group of people, and maybe they're gonna talk about the hardships in life and the difficulties that they are facing. And when we're talking about these sad groups of people, we're not talking about small sizes, and that's because sad people are magnets for other sad people. They would like to hear other people's stories, and sometimes they would want to share as well. What's interesting about it is that within all these threads of comments and replies, you're always going to find a topic that keeps on recirculating itself, and that is, you have one person stating how amazing and how comforting a hot shower could be when you are in that situation, and below the replies you have lots of people. I'm exaggerating when I say hundreds, but I'm gonna use that word anyway. When you got hundreds of replies at the bottom, basically relating towards the same thing. You go, oh yeah, I feel the same thing too. I feel the same way. I take more than 30 minutes in a shower or a bath just because it feels so nice and comforting. And the thing is, I relate to this as well. You see, I take 3 showers in a day, or at the very least, I try my very best to take those 3 showers in a day. Those 3 long showers, very long. Sometimes it could reach 20 to 30 minutes, 40 max. Yeah, it's quite a long time. And one other thing, the temperature, that must be very strictly regulated. It needs to be hot, and I won't accept any other temperature, otherwise it would not feel good and I wouldn't enjoy it too well. Fascinating thing, surprise, surprise. All around the world, you have many people who somehow, most probably experience the same comfort that I feel when they are taking a hot shower too. This fact I actually just shrugged off for a while, but more recently I've been starting to think that there needs to be, or there has to be, an explanation for this somehow, and quite surprisingly, some research has been done on this topic. Really fascinating results that I'd like to share. The year is 2012. John A. Barth and Edith Shalev from Yale University, both of them, published a study on the journal Emotion titled "The Suitability of Physical and Social Warmth in Daily Life." Free to read, free to access, links in the description below. At the experiment's very core, it simply consisted of asking participants on separate occasions, number 1, regarding how long they take a bath, how frequently they take a bath, and the temperature that they regularly take a bath at. Number 2 would be how lonely they are, as determined by the UCLA Loneliness Scale, which is basically a set of questions that, when answered, will give you a scale which I think is from 0 to 10 or from 1 to 10, that determines how lonely you are. and the study found correlation with all three factors of bathing. That is, the more frequent that you bathe or shower, the longer the duration of the bath or shower, and the higher the temperature of that bathing or showering, that is correlated with how lonely you are. And all of these correlations were found to be significant such that it could explain 32.5% of the variations in the data, judging by how lonely a person is. But that wasn't all that they did, otherwise it would have been a pretty short paper, don't you think? They did 3 other studies. The next one, it consisted of placing participants in either a warm environment or a cold environment and letting them take the UCLA loneliness test. And what they found was in a warmer environment, people scored less on the loneliness scale, while in the colder environment, people scored higher on the loneliness scale. And they explained these results with the hypothesis that experiencing coldness triggers that feeling of being excluded, and basically you get recalled of these memories, while the opposite is true when you are in a warmer environment. And instead you feel more pro-social, and that warmth triggers some part of you to feel like a social person, to feel like you are included, and that supports the correlation between loneliness and physical temperatures that they first established within their first study. Now, their third study is based on the fact that when you recall a moment in your life when you feel excluded, you will in turn feel the need to reassociate yourself or reaffiliate yourself with people. It doesn't have to be the people who specifically excluded you in the first place, but just anyone at all, really. Now, this phenomenon is very well accepted. It has been tested and replicated many times such that it has become more or less sort of a fact. Now, what's clear is that whenever you experience feelings of social coldness, and when I say that, I mean that feeling of being excluded, that has to be compensated by experiencing social warmth, and it's almost as if this is hardwired into our brains. Now, what's less clear is whether feeling social coldness can be compensated by feeling physical warmth instead of social warmth, and that is what is being tested with this third study. Participants are asked to recall times when they felt excluded, and then after that there are 2 groups. One of them will just hug a hot pack that is like a bag of hot water or some hot liquid or something like that, and then the other will hug a cold pack, which is basically same as a hot pack but just with a cold liquid instead. After they are made to hug these packs of hot or cold water, they are then asked whether they would like to reassociate themselves with people and engage in social activities. Now, recall the fact that whenever you remember a bad memory, a bad social memory, the typical response would be that you would want to engage yourself in social activities again. But you don't see that happening in people who hug the hot pack, and basically this proves their hypothesis that social coldness can be compensated for physical warmth, such that you don't need social warmth, and that is in turn replaced by that hugging of the hot pack so that you feel less of the need to go out and engage in social activities. Now, fourth study that this duo did was to test whether the participants had awareness of the correlation between loneliness and temperature, and what they found was that the participants failed to connect these two dots together, and their inability to be aware of the connection between physical temperature and social temperature means that the participants were using physical temperature as a coping mechanism in order to compensate for their lack of social warmth in their life. Now that marks the end of their study, and based from all the results that I've summarized for you, it is clear to see that physical temperature and social temperature are at least correlated to some extent, and that people use physical warmth to deal with their social coldness, just because, social warmth is more difficult to get. The surprising thing not only comes from this study, but it comes from a multitude of other studies which demonstrates the same results, and I will summarize all of them to my best capabilities. We have always been using words based on concrete physical experiences metaphorically to describe more emotional experiences. So when we say that he is a warm person or she is a warm person, then that warm individual is considered to be pro-social, cooperative, generous, and trusting, whereas when you describe someone as a cold individual, they are viewed as self-centered and competitive and untrustworthy. But it's interesting to think of why we decided to use the terms warm and cold to refer to these personality traits. These concepts that are concerning the physical world, such as distance, size, and temperature, theory is that they form in early childhood because they are based from a direct and concrete experiences, and they do not require the language abilities or memory retrieval skills that come online years later. And you see loads of examples of this happening within our language, especially in social and psychological phenomenon, like when we say, oh, it's a distant relationship, I can feel our relationship is growing further apart. Or in opposite, you say that our relationship is so close to each other. So you're using physical language of distance to describe something that is more emotional or actually more intangible. How early childhood experiences shape the associative connection between physical experiences and psychological experiences. Like when you're close to someone and you give them a hug, for example. So basically that closeness between people is correlated with that feeling of love and trust and all that other stuff. While if you are away from someone, like you're in one corner of the room and the other person is not in another corner of the room, then that suggests that you two are not getting along well. So these two things, this physical interpretation and a psychological interpretation, those two have strong associative connection, that when you're physically distant, it immediately implies that there is something emotionally or psychologically going wrong between the two of you. Evolutionary basis or a childhood basis of how a physical interpretation and a psychological interpretation are so strongly correlated with each other. Now we're going to look at some studies. in 1958, Harry Harlow. He basically used monkeys. Yeah, he used monkeys, and these are mother monkeys basically. They had the mothers either cuddle their baby with a cloth, and that cloth is a warm cloth. And then they had another group where they did the same thing but with a cold cloth. And what happens is, when those babies grow up, you find that the group that has been cuddled in the warm cloth, they turn out to be more social than the monkeys that grew up in the cold cloth. Next, another study done by Williams and Barr in 2008. Basically, they put participants in a warm environment and then another one in a cold environment, and then they asked them to donate. So you're gonna see that people in the warm room, they're gonna donate more than people in the cold room. Next, Zerman and Semin in 2009, they seated participants in either a cold or warm room and found that those in the warmer room reported feeling interpersonally closer to the experimenter than those in the colder room. Next, same guy again, William and Barr, but this time done in 2010, which is, they showed that letting someone experience a physical warmth produce a greater trust in an economics trust game compared to letting them experience feelings of coldness. Now another study, because as I've said, you've got lots of evidence, and this one is done by Zong and Leonardelli in 2008, showed that after an actual or remembered social rejection experience, participants report the temperature of the room as being colder than those who had just recalled an inclusion experience. The participants who remembered a social rejection experience, they actually showed a greater desire for warm food and drinks rather than the rest of the other participants. Next, another one by Itzerman and Semin. They found that social distance manipulation also produced changes in the perception of room temperature, so they had people either made them sit closely to each other or made them sit far apart from each other. And what happens is that when they are seated more far apart, they will estimate the room temperature to be colder than it actually is, while when they're seated close to each other, they will estimate the room temperature to be higher than it actually is. Now this here is the most interesting piece of evidence, and it's a neurological evidence. Basically, the part of your brain that handles the processing of physical temperature, it also handles the processing of social warmth and social coldness, such that it is implicated with feelings of trust, empathy, and social emotions such as embarrassment and guilt. For anyone that's curious, the name of this part of the brain is known as the insular cortex. So all of these are pretty strong evidence that suggests the connection between physical warmth and social warmth, likewise physical coldness and social coldness. Before we continue on the discussion of this topic, I'd also like to mention that there have been attempts to replicate the original study 3 years later in 2015, and it's in fact published in the same journal as well, and the new results showed that they could not find any evidence that suggests the association between loneliness and bathing or showering habits, and they in fact did 9 replications. The thing is, this study was made specifically to criticize the original study. It was made in order to cast doubt on the idea that there exists a strong connection between trait loneliness and personal bathing habits that is related to warmth. Now, the original authors of the 2012 study quickly responded to this. At the same year, in fact, they did 3 further replications of their own study, and they did it across a wider geographic area. So they did it in India, in Israel, and also in North America, just like they did before. And what they found was, with this larger sample size, the correlation between bathing habits and loneliness is still there, albeit the significance or the correlation between the two is much lower than they originally discovered in their 2012 study. So that number that I said before, that 30-something%, basically that number is reduced so that loneliness can only explain the variability to a lesser extent than first originally thought. Additionally, they also commented on the results that were obtained from the other group of people. Now, the original authors of the 2012 paper complained that the new study that they did, the one with the 9 different replications, they said that 2 of them actually gave results that supported the correlation between loneliness and bathing habits, and that was because they closely followed the procedures from the original 2012 article. However, the 7 other studies had significant procedural changes, and they argue that this is why they couldn't replicate the results perfectly, in that they failed to find a significant correlation. The story, in fact, doesn't end there. The authors, the one that did the 9 different replications, they replied to that other study. What they did was they conducted a meta-analysis of all the data that they have gathered so far. So a meta-analysis is basically analyzing the analysis of the individual reports and basically compiling all of them to produce this grand conclusion that there is no significant correlation if we gather all of this data from all the different studies together. So basically what you have is a confusing back and forth argument between 2 research groups, and it's difficult to pick out which information is valid and which information is invalid. Now, I'm no statistical expert, so I can't tell you which experiments were better in a statistical point of view, but I can give you my unprofessional professional opinion on things. Number 1. Do I think that the original 2012 study had a hypothesis that is correct? To that I say, yeah, I do believe that they are correct, at least to a certain extent. And that is because of the huge number of evidence and previous study that also hint towards the correlation between physical temperature and social temperature. So I believe that there is something going on, a sort of interaction or relationship between those two. And the trump card of all these evidence, I personally believe, is the neurological evidence, in that the processing of physical temperature and of social temperature is regulated by the same part of the brain, and that very highly suggests that these 2 concepts are related in one way or another and in how we perceive them as human beings. Secondly, I think that the replication issue with other experiments is highly warranted, and that is because definitely you're gonna encounter some problems when researching about this topic, especially with bathing habits as one of the factors. Lots of unpredictable things can happen, honestly. Some people, they take hot showers for other reasons than feeling lonely, and other times you have people that can't take baths or showers as frequently as they personally desire to just because they are busy and have lots of work to do. Not to mention cultural and social differences with bathing habits that are, well, basically different in different parts of the world. So yeah, these kinds of studies are hard to replicate, and it's understandable why some studies weren't able to replicate it. But I do strongly believe that there is a correlation in the data simply because of all the other evidences that has been put out to support this statement, and personally through the fact that I feel so much better in a hot shower when I am put in those sorts of situations. Now, some final words before I finally end this video. It's actually taking a really long amount of time, and I'm sorry. I myself did not intend for it to be this long, but just want to take this time to talk about loneliness and depression, all that sort of nasty stuff in general. And I just want to say that it's important to view these things as diseases instead of, something else. And that's because it really is a disease. Loneliness and depression, those sorts of things actually increase the risk of developing several serious diseases such as cancer, and also brain diseases such as dementia and Alzheimer's when you get older. And you also get reduced immune function as a result of depression and loneliness, so you get sick more often. Uh, Aside from that, of course, you're gonna get increased suicidal tendencies as well. So it's as if you're not, if you don't have the guts to kill yourself, the body just does its job for you by letting you have cancer and get flu like 20 times in a year, and then you just die from that. So it's a really sad fact that people are not only suffering from loneliness in the general sense, but also in the fact that this has a direct effect not only on their mental health, but also on their physical health. Social contact and happiness is, I should say, a basic human need for just about everybody. I say just about because I am aware that some people are genuinely happy from being alone and not talking to people for like 20 or 30 years. They're genuinely fine with that, and I am honestly shocked. So yeah, it is a basic need, at least for 99.999% of the population. And just like any basic need, if you run out of food, if you run out of water, basically bad things can happen. So I'm really advocating for the fact that these sorts of problems should be treated as diseases, because it it came as a result of a lack of a basic human need, and that leads to biochemical changes in the body, in the brain, that develops into nasty things later on. And it is indeed a serious problem. Because I don't know how many people out there are, but there are people who are literally sitting in their showers for hours just to activate the part of their brain that gets activated the same way as you would when you're socializing with people. And they're doing that because they lack the capabilities to interact socially with people, and they're forced to sit in the showers to activate that part of the brain just as a compensation, because you're lacking it so much that you get desperate in that sense. So yeah, I hope you're all feeling well, especially at these rough times and situations. If you've made it to the very end, then thank you, because this is a really long video. Yeah, I'm grateful if you've made it this far. Yeah, see you in the next video.